I just wanted to fly home to see my dying mother. A flight attendant decided I looked like a thief. She had security drag me off the plane in handcuffs. 200 passengers watched and filmed everything. 3 weeks later, I walked back onto that same aircraft. This time, I wasn't sitting in coach. The officer who cuffed me went pale reading my badge. What happened next ended her career forever. Felt like such a small thing. My name is Simone Carter, 38 years old, and for 12 years I've worked in aviation safety. A career I built after growing up watching planes take off from a cracked backyard in East Cleveland. I live in Atlanta with my husband Marcus and our daughter Zoe. And that Thursday in March I was flying Skyline Atlantic Flight 447 from JFK. Coach seat 14C. Headed home. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. My mother, Loretta, had been in the hospital for 2 weeks after a stroke. And I'd flown to New York for one grueling work trip before rushing back to her bedside. I was exhausted, running on airport coffee and worry, dressed down in jeans and a hoodie, my company badge tucked deep inside my carry-on where nobody would ever think to look for it. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. At the gate, passengers clustered near the counter, while a tall woman in a crisp Skyline uniform paced with a clipboard, scanning the crowd like she was hunting for something wrong. Her name tag read Deborah Whitfield, Senior Flight Attendant. Her posture was perfect, her tone clipped, and every gate agent near her seemed to shrink a little whenever she spoke, as if they'd learned the hard way not to cross her. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Deborah snapped at a young family for taking too long finding their boarding passes, tapping her pen against her clipboard while the father fumbled through his phone. "We do have a schedule," she said, loud enough for the whole gate to hear. The mother apologized twice. Deborah didn't smile, didn't soften, just watched them shuffle past like she was grading their performance and they'd already failed. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. When I boarded, Deborah's eyes swept over me for half a second longer than they had the man in front of me, a white businessman in a suit. I told myself it was nothing. I'd flown enough to know that flight attendants size up rows of strangers all day. I smiled at her anyway, said good morning, and she gave me a tight nod before turning to the next passenger. I filed it away without fully understanding why. A man boarded behind me with a suitcase clearly too large for the overhead bin, and Deborah waved him through with barely a glance. My carry-on, a modest backpack that fit easily under the seat, earned a pointed instruction to make sure that's properly stowed. "We take this seriously." I nodded, said of course, and told myself she was just doing her job thoroughly that morning. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. I found seat 14C between an elderly woman by the window and a college kid already asleep against the aisle glass. The woman smiled warmly, scooting her purse to make room for my bag. "Long trip?" she asked, and I told her I was headed home to see my sick mother. Her face softened immediately. "I'll say a prayer for her," she said, and I believed she meant it. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. Her name was Eleanor Patterson, 71, flying back from visiting her son in Manhattan. On her wrist sat a delicate emerald bracelet, small stones catching the cabin light whenever she moved her hand. "My husband gave me this the year before he passed," she told me, turning her wrist so I could see it better. "I never fly without it." Feels like he's still with me. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. Her grandson called on video chat before we pushed back. A chubby-cheeked toddler waving at the screen, and Eleanor beamed through the whole call. Across the aisle, his father struggled one-handed to buckle a squirming younger child into a car seat. I leaned over without thinking and helped snap the buckle closed, and the little boy giggled, delighted, kicking his feet against the seat back. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. I didn't notice Deborah watching until I glanced up and caught her eyes locked on me from the galley curtain. Her expression unreadable, almost calculating. She murmured something to the younger flight attendant beside her, who glanced over at me too, then quickly looked away and busied herself restocking the beverage cart, avoiding my gaze the rest of the boarding process entirely. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. That younger attendant's name tag read Amingwin. And unlike Deborah, her smile reached her eyes when she passed out earbuds and pillows. She was new, maybe 6 months into the job, and every time Deborah spoke her name sharply from across the cabin, Amy flinched like a kid bracing for a scolding, moving faster, apologizing for things that weren't mistakes at all. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. During the safety demonstration, Deborah's voice cut through the cabin PA system harder than necessary, scolding a teenager for having his seatbelt too loose and telling a man near the exit row that he clearly hadn't been listening before he'd even had a chance to look up. Passengers exchanged glances. Nobody said anything. With it for years. In hindsight, the signs were already there. Once we reached cruising altitude, I closed my eyes and let my head rest against the seat, my mind drifting to my mother's hospital room, the beeping monitors, the way her left hand had curled since the stroke. Marcus had texted an update that morning. Stable, but tired. I exhaled slowly, telling myself I'd be there by evening, that everything would somehow be fine. I held on to that thought longer than expected. When the beverage cart came through, Deborah served the row in front of me and the row behind without pausing, skipping mine entirely, moving on to the next section like my row simply didn't exist. I assumed it was an oversight. Maybe she'd miscounted and didn't think to flag it down. I'd learn later that Deborah Whitfield rarely made mistakes she didn't intend. It was a small crack, barely visible then. 2 rows up, an older black man in a Morehouse cap caught my eye and gave a small, knowing nod. The kind exchanged between strangers who recognize something familiar in each other without needing words. I nodded back, unsure exactly what he'd seen, though something in his expression told me he'd clocked Deborah's behavior long before I had fully registered it myself. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Later, refilling water near the galley, I overheard Amy quietly mention to another crew member that Deborah had her own way of doing things and had flown this route for 22 years without a single write-up. Nobody questions her, the other attendant whispered back. She trained half the senior staff. People are scared of her. Honestly, more than they respect her. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. We hit a patch of turbulence somewhere over Virginia, the seatbelt sign chiming on, and Deborah strode down the aisle barking at anyone still in the aisle to sit immediately, her voice sharper with each step. A young mother trying to soothe a crying infant got told to handle that faster, in a tone that made 3 nearby passengers visibly stiffen in their seats. I couldn't have predicted what came next. I stood briefly to stretch my back, stiff from the earlier flight and the hospital chair I'd been sleeping in for a week straight. Deborah appeared almost instantly at my elbow. "Can I help you find your seat?" she asked, though I hadn't moved more than a foot from it and clearly wasn't lost. I said I was fine, just stretching, and sat back down. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. I told myself she was probably exhausted too. That flight attendants dealt with difficult passengers all day and maybe she'd simply misjudged the moment. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, the way I always tried to with people, even when some quiet part of me had already started keeping score without fully admitting it to myself. Later, I think back on it often. Eleanor turned to me again somewhere over North Carolina, holding up her wrist to catch the light better. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked, and I agreed it was stunning, asking about the craftsmanship. She laughed, delighted that someone appreciated it, and told me stories about her late husband's terrible taste in gifts except for this one perfect exception he'd gotten right. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, when her grandson's toy fire truck rolled loose and skidded under her seat, I leaned across without thinking and retrieved it, handing it back to the boy across the aisle while Eleanor thanked me warmly, patting my arm. It was such a small, ordinary moment. I had no idea it would become the single detail everything else would be built on top of. It seemed minor against everything else happening. From the galley, Deborah murmured to Amy, low enough that she clearly thought no one else could hear. "She's been all over that woman's seat the whole flight." Amy blinked, confused. "She was just helping with the toy," Amy said carefully. Deborah's jaw tightened. She said flatly, "Trust me." Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Amy didn't push back further, though her expression stayed uneasy, glancing toward me a few times like she was trying to reconcile what she'd just witnessed with what Deborah insisted she'd seen. She busied herself restocking napkins instead, choosing silence over confrontation, a choice that would matter more than she could have possibly understood in that moment. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. The flight settled into a long, uneventful stretch after that, the cabin humming with quiet conversation and the low drone of engines. I drifted in and out of sleep, grateful for the brief peace, unaware that in the galley 2 rows behind me, a decision was already quietly forming, one that had nothing to do with anything I had actually done. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. As we began our descent into Atlanta, the seatbelt chime sounded and Eleanor reached instinctively to touch her bracelet, a habit she said she'd developed to ground herself during landings. Her fingers found bare wrist. She paused, blinking down at her arm, patting it once more like she'd simply misjudged where it sat, a small flicker of confusion crossing her face. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. "That's strange," she murmured, more to herself than to me, patting her wrist a second time, then glancing at her lap, her sleeve, the seat pocket in front of her. I asked if everything was okay. She gave a small, uncertain laugh. "I'm sure it's just tangled in my sleeve somewhere," she said, though her eyes had already started to look worried. I didn't have the energy to question it further. "I can't find it," Eleanor said, her voice rising with real panic now, patting down her cardigan, checking her seat cushion, digging through her purse with trembling hands. "It was on my wrist the whole flight. I know it was. I felt a knot form in my stomach, more for her distress than anything else, and immediately offered to help her look. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. I checked the seat pocket in front of her, ran my hand along the crevice between the cushions, peered under both our seats while she anxiously repeated that it had definitely been there 20 minutes earlier. The college student beside me stirred awake, groggy, asking what was going on, and I explained quickly while continuing to search the floor near our feet. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Amy noticed the commotion and hurried over, crouching in the aisle to help search as well, her expression sympathetic and calm compared to what was coming. "It's probably just slipped somewhere," Amy said gently to Eleanor. "These clasps can be tricky. Let's stay calm and look carefully before we assume the worst. Okay?" It sat with me longer than I expected. That's when Deborah appeared, moving down the aisle with a purpose that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. She looked at Eleanor, then at me, her eyes narrowing with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "What happened?" she said. Not really a question, already certain she knew the answer before anyone had explained a single thing. Felt like such a small thing at the time. "Ma'am," Deborah said, turning to face me directly, "I'm going to need you to stand up." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" I asked. "Standard procedure," she said flatly, though nothing about her tone sounded procedural, and every passenger within earshot had already gone quiet, watching the scene unfold with the particular hush of people who sense something is about to go wrong. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. I stood, more out of a desire to avoid making a scene than any belief I actually needed to. I turned out my pockets, empty except for my phone and a crumpled boarding pass. Deborah watched closely, her jaw tight, clearly disappointed to find nothing there, though she didn't say so, just moved her gaze toward my backpack tucked beneath the seat. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. "I'll need to see inside your bag as well," she said, already reaching for it before I'd even agreed. I pulled it out myself instead, unwilling to let her hands go through my things without at least controlling the process, and unzipped it fully in the aisle for anyone to see, my heart hammering despite having absolutely nothing to hide. None of us knew where this was truly heading. By now, half the cabin had turned to watch, phones subtly angling upward from laps, whispers rippling row to row. I heard someone murmur, "What did she take?" as if my guilt were already an established fact rather than an accusation with zero evidence behind it. The presumption in that whisper stung more than I expected it to. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. I laid my bag's contents out on the empty seat beside me. My laptop, paperback novel, a half-eaten granola bar, my wallet, a folder of hospital paperwork for my mother. Nothing resembling a bracelet anywhere. I looked up at Deborah, waiting for an apology, or at least an acknowledgement. Instead, her expression only hardened further. I filed it away without fully understanding why. "She could have passed it to someone else," Deborah said, mostly to Amy but loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear clearly. "Or hidden it somewhere else in the cabin. I've seen it before." Absurd and unfounded, yet somehow already shaping the way nearby passengers were looking at me. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. With respect, The man in the Morehouse cap said, leaning into the aisle. You searched her bag, her pockets, and found nothing. Maybe it's time to consider she didn't take anything at all. Deborah's eyes flicked to him with visible irritation. Sir, this doesn't concern you, she said, and turned pointedly back toward me, dismissing him entirely. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. I have a responsibility to report any theft allegation before landing, Deborah continued, her voice taking on an official, rehearsed cadence, and I intend to follow proper protocol, regardless of how uncomfortable that makes anyone. I noticed she said theft, not missing item, not misplaced, theft. A word she'd chosen carefully and was not willing to walk back. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. Half a dozen people sat near Mrs. Patterson during this flight, I said, keeping my voice level though my hands had started to shake. The flight attendant serving drinks stood right beside her seat for a full minute. Why is it me you've decided to search? Deborah's answer came fast. Too fast. Like she'd rehearsed it in her head already. It was a quiet moment. Easy to miss. I have professional instincts developed over 22 years, she said, chin lifting slightly. And I trust them. It wasn't an answer. It was a deflection dressed up as authority. And the way she said it, so certain, so immovable, told me this wasn't really about the bracelet at all anymore. Not entirely. Not for her. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. Eleanor, visibly distressed by the scene unfolding around her, reached out and touched Deborah's sleeve. Maybe I just lost it earlier. At the airport, she offered weakly. I don't want anyone getting in trouble over this. Her voice had gone small, apologetic almost, as if she felt responsible for the storm she'd unintentionally set into motion. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. Deborah shook her head firmly. Mrs. I understand you're upset, but procedure requires us to document and report this before we deplane. For your protection and the airlines. It wasn't for Eleanor's protection. It wasn't for the airlines either. It was for whatever Deborah had already decided about me the moment she'd seen us talking. In hindsight, the signs were already there. Deborah turned and moved briskly toward the front galley, picking up the intercom phone connected to the cockpit. I heard fragments. Possible theft. We'll need assistance on arrival. Her voice calm and clinical, like she was reporting a mechanical issue instead of accusing a grieving woman of stealing jewelry from an old woman she'd been kind to for 2 hours. I held on to that thought longer than expected. My chest tightened as the reality of what was happening set in. My mother was lying in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, and I was about to be met by police because a flight attendant had decided, on nothing but instinct and a bracelet that had likely just slipped loose, that I was a thief who needed to be caught. It was a small crack, barely visible then. Amy stepped closer to Deborah near the galley, voice low but audible to those nearby. Are you sure about this? Thoroughly. Deborah didn't look up from the intercom. I know what I saw, she said simply. And Amy, after a beat of visible hesitation, stepped back and said nothing further. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. 3 or 4 phones were openly recording now, held low but angled toward me, capturing everything. My face, my open bag on the seat, Deborah's rigid posture in the aisle. I felt exposed in a way I'd never experienced before. My private grief and exhaustion suddenly a public spectacle for strangers who knew nothing about who I actually was. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. I kept my voice steady, my hands folded in my lap, refusing to give anyone footage of me losing composure, though inside I felt something hot and furious building beneath the surface. I thought of my mother, of Marcus waiting at arrivals, of how unbelievably far this had spiraled from a bracelet that had probably just slipped off a wrist. I couldn't have predicted what came next. Eleanor sat frozen beside me, clearly regretting having said anything at all, glancing between Deborah and me with an expression caught somewhere between guilt and confusion. "I really don't think she took it," she said quietly. To no one in particular, but by then the machinery Deborah had set in motion was already rolling forward, indifferent to doubt. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. The captain's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and oblivious, announcing our final descent into Atlanta, thanking us for flying Skyline Atlantic, hoping we had a pleasant stay. The mismatch between his warm, routine tone and the tension coiled through the cabin was almost unbearable, a reminder that somewhere up front, nobody yet knew what was unfolding back here. Later, I think back on it often, when the seatbelt sign clicked off at the gate. Passengers around us began gathering their things, but Deborah stepped into the aisle, blocking the path. "Everyone please remain seated," she announced over the cabin. "Except you," she said, looking directly at me. "I need you to stay right where you are until officers arrive." I noticed it, then let it go. For now, I stayed seated, my face burning, as the rest of the cabin filed past me toward the exit. Some passengers avoiding eye contact entirely, others openly staring like I was already convicted of something. A few offered sympathetic glances, quick and fleeting, gone before they could mean anything. I stared at my folded hands, counting my breaths, refusing to let my composure crack in front of strangers. It seemed minor against everything else happening. The man in the Morehouse cap paused beside my row despite the flow of exiting passengers, crouching briefly to press a business card into my hand. "I saw the whole thing," he said quietly. "My number's on there." I thanked him, throat tight, grateful for a single act of decency in the middle of everything collapsing around me. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Amy lingered near the galley longer than necessary, eventually crossing to hand me a small cup of water without a word, her eyes apologetic in a way her mouth clearly wasn't allowed to be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely audible, before Deborah's voice cut sharply from the front of the cabin, calling her back to help with deplaning duties immediately. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Eleanor tried to stay behind too, hovering near her seat even after being nudged twice by a gate agent to continue toward the jet bridge. "I'll wait for you outside," she told me, squeezing my hand once before reluctantly shuffling forward, glancing back over her shoulder with an expression that looked increasingly like regret settling into her features. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. 2 uniformed police officers boarded a few minutes later, their footsteps heavy against the aisle carpet, radios crackling at their hips. The taller one, a woman with close-cropped hair and a name badge reading Ruiz, scanned the mostly empty cabin before her eyes landed on me, Still seated, still holding my now empty water cup like an anchor. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. Deborah met them at the front, launching immediately into her version of events, her voice confident and rehearsed, painting a picture of suspicious behavior, close proximity to the victim's belongings, and a missing bracelet worth, she claimed without evidence, several $1,000s. She spoke with the certainty of someone reciting facts rather than assumptions dressed up as facts. I didn't have the energy to question it further. Officer Ruiz approached my row and asked, professionally but firmly, for identification. I handed over my driver's license, my hand steady despite everything churning inside me, and briefly explained that I was flying home to see my hospitalized mother and had no idea what had happened to any bracelet beyond helping search for it when it first went missing. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. Ruiz studied my license, then glanced toward Deborah for confirmation of the account. Deborah nodded emphatically, repeating that she'd witnessed me hovering near the victim's belongings multiple times during the flight, a description that stretched too brief, innocent moments into something that sounded, in her retelling, deliberate and calculated in a way it had never actually been. For now, I simply kept moving forward. We already searched her bag and pockets, Amy offered quietly from near the galley, prompting a sharp look from Deborah that silenced her instantly. Ruiz noted the comment anyway, jotting something in a small notepad, her expression unreadable but attentive, clearly cataloging details that didn't quite align cleanly with the story Deborah had presented so confidently moments earlier. It sat with me longer than I expected. The officers rechecked my backpack themselves, methodically this time, unzipping every pocket, running gloved fingers along the seams. Nothing. Laptop, hospital paperwork, granola bar wrapper. Exactly what I'd already shown Deborah twice. Ruiz's partner exchanged a brief glance with her, the kind that passes between two professionals quietly recalibrating their assumptions about a situation. Felt like such a small thing at the time. Eleanor was called back onto the plane to give her account directly to officers. She looked exhausted, apologetic, repeating that she wasn't entirely certain the bracelet had actually been stolen at all, that clasp sometimes failed, that she genuinely didn't want anyone getting into trouble over what might simply be her own carelessness earlier that day. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. Deborah interrupted twice, insisting Eleanor was just being kind, and urging the officers not to let politeness derail a legitimate investigation. Elderly victims often minimize what happened to them, she said, an assertion that had no basis in anything Eleanor had actually said or implied, but which Deborah delivered with the unwavering confidence of established fact. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. Ruiz's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of skepticism crossing her face as she watched Deborah steer the narrative so forcefully. Still, procedure required a full review before anyone could be cleared, and Ruiz explained calmly that we'd need to step off the aircraft to continue the conversation somewhere quieter, away from the remaining crew resetting the cabin for departure. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Walking off that jet bridge flanked by two officers remains one of the most humiliating moments of my life. Worse somehow than the accusation itself. New passengers waiting to board the return flight watched me pass, murmuring, several lifting phones to film as I walked by, my carry-on bag slung over one shoulder, my face carefully blank. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. I caught fragments of whispered speculation as I passed. Someone guessing I'd assaulted a flight attendant. Another insisting they'd definitely seen me pocket something. None of it was true. None of it mattered to the story already forming in strangers' minds, spreading faster than any correction could possibly catch up to it in that crowded, echoing terminal. I filed it away without fully understanding why. I managed to text Marcus before an officer gently asked me to keep my phone in my bag for now. Just 3 words. Something's wrong. Call security. Sent seconds before my hands were required to stay empty. I imagined him standing at arrivals with Zoe's stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm, waiting for a flight that had already landed without me walking out. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. The officers led me to a small security office near the gate. Fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead. A metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs facing each other like something out of a television interrogation rather than an actual conversation about a missing bracelet from a woman I'd known for exactly 2 hours before that flight. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. The room smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Ruiz sat across from me, notepad open, her partner standing near the door. "Walk me through the flight," she said, her tone noticeably gentler now that we were away from Deborah's insistent narration, and I found myself grateful for even that small, temporary shift in atmosphere. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. I explained everything clearly, methodically, despite the exhaustion pressing behind my eyes, describing the toy truck, the seatbelt buckle, the small kindnesses exchanged with Eleanor over 2 hours. Nothing more. Ruiz listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes, her expression growing more thoughtful as the actual timeline began to diverge from Deborah's more dramatic retelling of events. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. "The flight attendant said you were seen near the victim's seat multiple times throughout the flight," Ruiz said carefully. "Twice," I corrected. "Once to buckle a toddler's seatbelt across the aisle. Once to pick up a drop toy that rolled under her seat. Both times other passengers were present and can confirm exactly what happened." Ruiz noted this down without comment. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. Deborah appeared briefly at the office door, uninvited, suggesting officers conduct a more thorough search and mentioning, almost casually, that a female officer might want to check other places the bracelet could be concealed. The implication landed like a slap. Ruiz's jaw tightened visibly, and she asked Deborah, with clipped politeness, to wait outside the office. Nothing about it felt urgent. "Not yet, ma'am. We've already searched her belongings twice," Ruiz said, an edge creeping into her otherwise professional tone. "Unless you have additional evidence beyond a hunch, I need you to let us handle this from here." Deborah opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to reconsider, retreating into the hallway with visible reluctance, clearly unaccustomed to being told no. In hindsight, the signs were already there. A station manager appeared moments later, clipboard in hand, visibly stressed about the flight's delayed turnaround, asking how much longer this would take. Ruiz explained they were still verifying details. The manager glanced at me, then toward the hallway where Deborah stood, and something in his expression suggested this wasn't the first time her name had come up in a delay report. I held on to that thought longer than expected. We're waiting on confirmation that the item wasn't located elsewhere on the aircraft, Ruiz explained, checking her watch. Cleaning crews were sweeping the cabin, checking seat cushions, overhead bins, lavatories, anywhere a bracelet might have genuinely slipped and settled during 2 hours of ordinary flight turbulence. A possibility nobody besides Eleanor seemed willing to actually consider seriously. It was a small crack, barely visible then. I glanced at the clock on the office wall, doing rapid math in my head. Visiting hours, evening traffic to the hospital, how much daylight my mother might have left in a lucid state before her evening medication made conversation difficult. Every minute in that room felt like sand slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Amy appeared briefly in the hallway, hesitating near the office door as if working up the nerve to say something. Deborah intercepted her instantly, murmuring something low and sharp, and Amy's shoulders dropped as she turned and walked away without ever crossing the threshold. Whatever she'd wanted to say swallowed back down before it reached anyone who needed to hear it. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. Meanwhile, the man from seat 12A tried locating a gate agent willing to take his statement, insisting he'd witnessed the entire interaction and that nothing about my behavior had warranted this level of scrutiny. He was told, politely but firmly, that witness statements would be collected if needed, a phrase that felt less like reassurance and more like dismissal. I couldn't have predicted what came next. Reviewing her notes, Ruiz asked Eleanor to describe the bracelet's clasp once more. Eleanor paused, thinking hard, then described a small hook-style closure, slightly loose, one she'd meant to get repaired for months. Ruiz underlined something in her notepad, a detail that, paired with the earlier turbulence, suggested a far more mundane explanation than theft. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. Nearly 40 minutes in, I finally asked, voice tight with barely restrained emotion, if I could call my husband. Ruiz nodded, stepping out briefly to give me privacy, a small kindness that meant more than she probably realized in that sterile little room that had started to feel smaller with every passing minute. Later, I think back on it often. Marcus picked up on the first ring, his voice already tense with worry. I explained as calmly as I could manage, though my voice cracked twice describing the handcuff-free but still humiliating walk-off that jet bridge. I'm coming down there right now, he said immediately, and I heard Zoe's small voice in the background asking what was wrong with Mommy. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, don't, I told him, steadying my voice. It'll make things worse if you show up upset. Let me handle this calmly. I haven't done anything wrong, and I need them to see that clearly, without anyone giving them a reason to say I'm being difficult or that my family is causing a scene. He reluctantly agreed, though I could hear how hard that was for him. It seemed minor against everything else happening. A station manager named Grant Whitaker, unrelated to the CEO who shared a similar name, stopped by briefly, informing Ruiz that the flight's departure had already been delayed 20 minutes and asking, not unkindly, whether this could be resolved soon. He glanced toward Deborah in the hallway with an expression that suggested this delay would not go unnoted in some internal report. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Sensing her authority slipping, Deborah reappeared at the doorway once more, insisting that standard procedure for suspected theft required additional measures, including, she suggested, a full pat-down conducted by security personnel before anyone could be cleared to leave the premises entirely, regardless of what evidence had or hadn't been found up to that point. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. There's no legal basis for that without probable cause beyond a missing item that hasn't even been confirmed stolen, Ruiz said firmly, her patience visibly thinning. We've searched her belongings twice. Nothing was found. More concrete. I'm not authorizing anything further. Deborah's face flushed, though she said nothing more in response. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. For the first time since boarding, I saw something shift in Ruiz's eyes, a quiet recalibration, the professional distance of someone beginning to suspect the story she'd been handed didn't fully hold together under closer examination. It wasn't vindication yet, not even close, but it was the first small crack of daylight in an otherwise suffocating afternoon. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. I still need you to wait a bit longer while we finalize the report, Ruiz told me gently, closing her notepad. I know this has been a long, unfair afternoon. I'm sorry for that. Fixed anything? Not yet. But it was the first one I'd received from anyone in an official capacity since this entire ordeal had begun. I didn't have the energy to question it further. 20 minutes later, Ruiz returned to tell me the report would list the incident as an unresolved missing item. No charges filed. No evidence of theft found anywhere on the aircraft or in my possession. You're free to go, she said, sliding a card across the table with a case number printed on it. In case you want to follow up later, that small detail would resurface again soon enough. I took the card with shaking hands, relief and exhaustion crashing over me at once, though something underneath both feelings still felt unfinished, unsettled, like a held breath I couldn't quite release yet. I thanked Ruiz sincerely. Whatever institutional failures had brought me to that room, she at least had treated me like a person rather than a suspect by the end. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Marcus was waiting just outside the security checkpoint, and the moment he saw me, he crossed the distance in 3 long strides, wrapping his arms around me without a word. I let myself lean into him fully for the first time in hours, my composure finally cracking, though I forced the tears back down before we reached the parking garage. It sat with me longer than I expected. We drove straight to the hospital in near silence, both of us processing in our own way. My mother was awake when I arrived, her face lighting up despite the droop still lingering on one side from the stroke. I took her good hand in mine and told her, simply, that I'd made it, leaving out everything else that had happened along the way. Felt like such a small thing at the time. I called Zoe before bedtime, listening to her recount her entire school day in exhaustive 8-year-old detail, grateful for the ordinary normalcy of her voice after such an abnormal afternoon. My own mother, watching me from her hospital bed, asked once if everything was all right with my flight. I told her it was fine, unwilling to add worry to her already fragile recovery. I didn't think much of it then, not yet, for those few hours in that hospital room. I let myself set the afternoon aside entirely, focusing only on my mother's slow, careful sentences and the small victories of her physical therapy that day. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken since boarding that plane in New York, a fragile pocket of peace before the next wave inevitably arrived. Looking back, That detail mattered more than I realized. Back at the airport, a cleaning crew combed the aircraft thoroughly during its scheduled turnaround, checking every seat pocket, seam, and crevice in the row where Eleanor had sat. They found gum wrappers, a lost earbud, a child's crayon, but no bracelet anywhere, a result that should have settled the matter definitively for anyone genuinely interested in the truth. None of us knew where this was truly heading. When the station manager informed Deborah of the search results, she reportedly insisted the bracelet must have been disposed of somewhere before the search. Perhaps flushed, perhaps handed off during deplaning to an accomplice waiting at the gate. Theories that grew increasingly elaborate with each retelling, none of them supported by a single shred of actual evidence. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. Deborah drove home that evening seething, replaying the moment Officer Ruiz had shut down her request for a further search. A moment that felt to her less like professional caution and more like a personal humiliation in front of colleagues she'd supervised for years. 22 years without a single formal complaint. She told herself, and now this. I filed it away without fully understanding why. Rather than let the matter rest, Deborah sat down that night and filed her own internal incident report with Skyline Atlantic, describing me as uncooperative and evasive during questioning. Details that directly contradicted both Ruiz's notes and the memories of every passenger who'd witnessed the actual interaction unfold in that cramped, tense cabin. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. She also posted a vague, self-justifying account on a private online forum for flight crew, describing a passenger who'd gotten awfully cozy with an elderly woman's belongings, fishing for the validation of colleagues who, predictably, rushed to affirm her instincts, several commenting variations of trust your gut. You've seen this 100 times before. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. What none of those commenters knew, and what Deborah conveniently left out, was that 18 months earlier she'd made a nearly identical accusation against a different black passenger on a flight to Chicago. An incident quietly resolved after the item in question turned up in the accuser's own coat pocket. Never publicly corrected, never mentioned again by anyone at the airline. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. That evening, while I sat beside my mother's hospital bed, watching the muted television flicker across the wall, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Skyline Atlantic number. A woman from Human Resources introduced herself, informing me, in careful corporate language, that an internal incident report had been filed regarding passenger conduct during my flight earlier that day. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. I sat frozen for a moment, stunned that despite being cleared by actual law enforcement, the airline itself was now opening its own file on me, treating an unfounded accusation as though it carried equal weight to the facts Officer Ruiz had already documented. This is still active? I asked, disbelief creeping into my exhausted voice. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. The HR representative assured me it was standard procedure whenever an incident is reported by crew, promising someone would follow up within the week. I hung up and stared at the ceiling long after my mother had drifted to sleep. Quiet, steady resolve settling over the exhaustion. Whatever this was, I wasn't going to let it simply disappear into a filing cabinet. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. By the next morning, a 14-second clip from that gate area had been uploaded to social media, captioned, "Flight attendant catches passenger trying to steal elderly woman's bracelet mid-flight." It showed only the moment I stood up to empty my bag, my expression tense. No context. No mention of the search that turned up nothing. No mention of the 2 innocent moments that had started everything. In hindsight, the signs were already there. By noon, the clip had been shared thousands of times. Comments flooding in with a speed and cruelty that left me nauseous scrolling through them. Strangers speculating about my character, my intentions, my supposed criminal history, based entirely on 14 seconds engineered to look damning without a single fact to actually support the caption attached to it. I held on to that thought longer than expected. Someone identified me by name within hours, pulling details from a since-deleted old social media account, and my phone began buzzing with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Some cruel, a few oddly apologetic. All of it a violation of privacy I hadn't consented to and couldn't do anything to undo once it started spreading. It was a small crack, barely visible then. Marcus found me sitting on the hospital hallway floor outside my mother's room, phone in hand, staring blankly at a comment calling me a name I won't repeat. One that stripped away every ounce of context about who I actually was and reduced me to nothing but a caricature built from someone else's careless accusation. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. "Don't read any more of it," he said gently, crouching beside me, gently prying the phone from my hand. "None of those people were there. None of them know you." The words had already burrowed somewhere deep. The particular sting of being publicly disbelieved by thousands of strangers who'd never once looked me in the eye. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. My mother, still recovering, asked why I looked so pale that morning during physical therapy. I told her I hadn't slept well. Another small lie stacked on top of the first. Unwilling to add this weight onto her fragile recovery when her body already had so much else to focus on rebuilding after the stroke. I couldn't have predicted what came next. Reporters began emailing Skyline Atlantic's press office by Friday, several reaching out to me directly through old work contacts who'd apparently forwarded my information without asking. I ignored every message, unwilling to comment publicly while an internal investigation loomed, though the silence itself seemed to fuel further speculation online rather than quiet it. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. A local news affiliate ran a 30-second segment that evening under the headline "Passenger Accused of Theft Mid-Flight. Airline Investigating," using the same misleading clip. Again without context. Again without reaching out to me for comment beforehand. Treating an unproven accusation as though it were an established, newsworthy fact worth broadcasting statewide. Later, I think back on it often. Eleanor called me that night, distraught, having seen the segment herself. "I told them it probably just fell off," she said, voice cracking. "I never said you stole anything. I don't understand how this got so twisted." I thanked her for calling, though her guilt, however genuine, did little to slow what was already spreading. I noticed it, then let it go. For now. Meanwhile, Deborah agreed to an interview with the same local station. Sitting in her Skyline uniform, describing her instincts and her duty to protect passengers, carefully omitting that no bracelet had ever actually been found, that police had cleared me, that her own colleague Amy had questioned her account in real time on the aircraft itself. It seemed minor against everything else happening. The interview aired with a Chiron reading "Flight Attendant." I was just doing my job, and within it Deborah painted herself as a diligent professional unfairly.
Maligned by online backlash. Flipping the narrative so completely that viewers came away believing she was the one who'd been wronged in this entire situation. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling.
I watched that segment sitting in my mother's hospital room, jaw clenched, hands trembling slightly as Deborah's calm, practiced voice explained away every hole in her story with the same unwavering confidence she'd used on that plane. Somewhere in that moment, my quiet resolve hardened into something sharper, something closer to determination than exhaustion. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. My college roommate, now a civil rights attorney in Charlotte, called after seeing the segment shared in a mutual friends group chat. "You need to document everything," Priya Reeves told me firmly. "Every message, every call, every name. Don't respond publicly yet. Let them build their case against themselves first, and we'll be ready when it matters." Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. I started keeping a folder, screenshots of the video, the news segment, the HR call log, Eleanor's texts, the officer's card with the case number. Felt strange, almost paranoid, building a paper trail against people who were supposed to represent an airline I trusted enough to fly with for years. But Priya insisted it would matter eventually. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. Amy reached out to me quietly through a mutual acquaintance from the flight crew's scheduling office, asking, carefully, whether I'd be willing to talk. When we finally spoke by phone, her voice shook. "I should have said more on the plane," she admitted. "I've been sick about it ever since. I'm scared to file anything against Deborah, though. She has a lot of power over new hires. I didn't have the energy to question it further."
I understand. It's all here.
And I meant it, though something in me quietly registered that Amy's silence, however understandable, was exactly the kind of silence that let people like Deborah operate unchecked for 2 decades. I didn't push her, not yet, but I filed her name away carefully, the way you remember a door that might one day need opening. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. Mr. The passenger from seat 12A posted his own account online without my asking. A calm, detailed description of everything he'd witnessed, tagging the local news station and Skyline Atlantic directly. His post gained traction slower than the original clip. Truth typically travels slower than outrage, but it began shifting the conversation. Slowly, in small pockets. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Comment sections started splitting into 2 camps. One still convinced of my guilt based on the original clip. Another increasingly skeptical after reading Mr. Danielle's account and noting the conspicuous absence of any actual recovered bracelet in a story that had, after all, started with an accusation of theft. It sat with me longer than I expected. Felt like such a small thing at the time. Skyline Atlantic's official statement, released Monday, was carefully vague, promising a thorough internal review, while neither confirming nor denying wrongdoing on either side. A masterclass in corporate non-commitment that satisfied absolutely no one and left both Deborah's supporters and my own increasingly frustrated with the lack of any real accountability. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. That same day, I received a formal letter, not an email this time, an actual letter, informing me that my presence was requested at an internal review hearing the following. Weak to address concerns raised by flight crew regarding passenger conduct during Flight 447. A phrase so bloodless it almost concealed the humiliation buried inside it. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. I stared at that letter for a long time, turning over a decision I hadn't fully admitted to myself I was even considering. I could reveal, right now, exactly who I was within that company's own structure. Instead, some stubborn, wounded part of me wanted to see how this process would unfold if they believed I was simply nobody at all. None of us knew where this was truly heading. I discussed it with Marcus that night, both of us exhausted, sitting at our kitchen table with Zoe finally asleep upstairs. "You could end this in one phone call," he said. "I know," I told him, "but I need to know how deep this goes first. If I flash my badge now, I'll never actually find out." It was one more piece I'd remember for years. What I didn't fully say aloud, not even to Marcus, was how personal this had become. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every passenger who looked like me who'd ever been quietly humiliated on a flight and told to simply move on. Their complaints filed away and forgotten by people who never had to answer for any of it. I filed it away without fully understanding why. 2 days before the hearing, I received an unexpected email from an internal Skyline Atlantic address I didn't immediately recognize. Sender name Priya Sheikh. Senior Counsel. Employee Relations. Subject line marked urgent and confidential. The kind of email that made my stomach tighten before I'd even opened it. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. Priya Shah's email was brief but startling. She'd recognized my name cross-referenced against the internal incident report and wanted to speak privately before the hearing.
Mentioning only that there was relevant history I should be aware of regarding the flight attendant named in the complaint against me. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss.
We spoke by phone that evening, her voice careful, clearly weighing how much she was permitted to share. "This isn't the first complaint involving Deborah Whitfield," she said finally. "There was an incident 18 months ago. Passenger. Similar circumstances. Similar accusation. It was resolved. Quietly. And the file was never escalated the way it should have been. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. My hands went cold gripping the phone. Resolved how? I asked. Priya hesitated. User's own belongings, she said. Deborah's account was never corrected publicly. The passenger who'd been accused received an apology privately. But nothing about the pattern was flagged in Deborah's personnel file the way it should have been. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. Why wasn't it flagged? I pressed. Though some cynical part of me already suspected the answer before Priya even spoke it aloud. The employee relations manager who handled it at the time, Priya said carefully, was close friends with Deborah outside of work. He retired last year. Nobody's reopened that file since. In hindsight, the signs were already there. I sat with that information for a long time after hanging up. The shape of something much larger than a single bad flight beginning to form in my mind. This wasn't one flight attendant having one bad day. This was a pattern. Protected. Buried. Allowed to continue because the right people had simply chosen to look away. I held on to that thought longer than expected. Priya couldn't officially share documentation without violating employee privacy protocols. But she offered something else instead. She'd personally attend the hearing as an observer, ensuring the process at least followed proper procedure. A small but meaningful gesture from someone I'd never even met until that phone call 2 nights earlier. It was a small crack, barely visible then. Meanwhile, Eleanor, having grown increasingly upset by how far the story had spiraled from the truth, drafted a formal written statement to Skyline Atlantic clarifying that she had never accused me of theft, that she believed the bracelet had simply slipped loose during turbulence, and that Deborah had escalated the situation far beyond anything she herself had actually requested. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. She sent it by certified mail, insisting on a receipt, worried, rightly it turned out, that it might otherwise disappear into the same administrative void that seemed to have swallowed every inconvenient detail in this case so far. I appreciated her effort deeply, though I'd learn later just how right her instincts about disappearing paperwork actually were. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. Deborah, sensing the tide beginning to shift slightly against her narrative, grew more insistent rather than less, requesting a formal addition to the hearing agenda, a request that I be placed on Skyline Atlantic's internal watch list, a euphemism for passengers flagged for additional scrutiny on future flights, based entirely on an accusation that had already collapsed under basic scrutiny. I couldn't have predicted what came next. When Amy heard about this request through the crew grapevine, something in her finally cracked. She called me back, this time without hesitation in her voice. "I'll give a statement," she said. "I don't care what it costs me anymore. What she's trying to do to you isn't right, and I'm done staying quiet about it." Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. Amy's statement, once submitted, detailed the moment on the plane when she'd questioned Deborah's account in real time, Deborah's dismissive response, and her own growing discomfort. Throughout the entire encounter, a first-hand account from someone with nothing to gain and, given Deborah's seniority, genuinely something significant to lose by speaking up. Later, I think back on it often, with Priya's quiet involvement, Eleanor's certified statement, Mr. Danielle's public account, and now Amy's formal testimony. The picture forming ahead of the hearing looked increasingly different. From the one Deborah had spent a week carefully constructing in interviews and internal reports, though she remained, as far as I could tell, entirely unaware of how much ground had shifted beneath her. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, 3 days before the hearing, my mother took a small but frightening turn. A brief drop in oxygen levels that sent the hospital into a flurry of activity before stabilizing again within the hour. Sitting beside her bed afterward, badly shaken, I found myself questioning whether any of this fight was worth the energy I no longer felt I had left to spare. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Marcus found me in the hospital chapel that evening. The first time I'd cried freely since this entire ordeal had begun. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said softly, sitting beside me. "I know," I told him, wiping my face. "But I want to. Not for me." Has happened to before me and said nothing. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. That night, unable to sleep, I drafted my own statement for the hearing, careful and factual, describing every detail exactly as it had happened, deliberately leaving out any mention of my actual position at the company. still determined to let the process reveal its own character before I revealed mine. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Deborah, in the meantime, had grown bolder in her private conversations with colleagues, reportedly telling a fellow flight attendant that she intended to make sure I never flew Skyline again. A statement Amy later confirmed she'd overheard secondhand. One more small thread in a pattern that increasingly resembled personal vendetta rather than professional concern. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. I learned, through Priya, that Deborah had also quietly reached out to a union representative ahead of the hearing, framing herself as a loyal employee being unfairly targeted by outside pressure and social media backlash, successfully securing representation that would argue vigorously on her behalf regardless of what evidence actually surfaced during proceedings. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes carefully, a simple gray blazer, nothing that revealed anything about who I actually was within that company's structure. I wanted them to see, first, an ordinary passenger. I wanted to watch exactly how differently the room would treat me once they eventually learned otherwise. I didn't have the energy to question it further. Zoe, sensing something was different about that particular morning despite my best efforts to hide it, asked at breakfast why I looked so serious. Mommy has an important meeting, I told her, which was true enough, though nowhere near the full truth of what that meeting actually was or what it might ultimately mean. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. Marcus offered to come with me, but I asked him to stay with Zoe instead, needing, selfishly perhaps, to walk into that building alone, on my own terms, carrying nothing but the folder of evidence I'd built over the past week and whatever quiet resolve I had left after everything that had already happened. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Driving to Skyline Atlantic's regional headquarters that morning, I passed the exit for the airport itself, the same terminal where all of this had started less than 2 weeks earlier, and felt an odd, hollow recognition settle over me, like driving past the scene of something that had already fundamentally changed who I was. It sat with me longer than I expected. I checked in at the front desk under my legal name, Simone Carter, no title attached, and was directed to a conference room on the 4th floor, informed that the panel would be along shortly. That phrase landing with a chill I hadn't quite expected given everything I'd already braced myself for. Felt like such a small thing at the time. The conference room held a long table, several chairs already occupied by people I didn't recognize, HR representatives, a union liaison, and, seated near the far end, unmistakably composed and confident, Deborah Whitfield, dressed in her uniform despite this not being a working shift. A deliberate choice meant, I suspected, to project authority. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. She glanced at me as I entered, something flickering across her expression. Satisfaction, perhaps, or simple certainty that this room, this process, would ultimately validate everything she'd claimed from the very first moment on that aircraft nearly 2 weeks earlier. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Priya Shah entered a few minutes later, taking a seat quietly near the back as an observer, catching my eye briefly with a small, almost imperceptible nod. A silent reminder that I wasn't walking into this room entirely alone, whatever Deborah currently believed about the balance of power between us. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. The hearing chair. A stern-looking man named Robert Finch from corporate compliance opened proceedings by summarizing the complaint against me, reading Deborah's account, nearly verbatim from her original incident report. The same exaggerated version I'd already heard once on that aircraft and again in her television interview days earlier. I filed it away without fully understanding why. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. When it came time for me to respond, I spoke clearly and factually, laying out the actual sequence of events, referencing the police report, Officer Ruiz's findings, the cleaning crew's failed search, Eleanor's certified statement, and Amy's corroborating testimony. Watching Deborah's composed expression begin, almost imperceptibly, to tighten around the edges. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. Deborah's union representative pushed back hard, questioning the reliability of witnesses, suggesting Eleanor was simply confused and elderly, a characterization that made my jaw clench, and implying Amy's statement was motivated by workplace jealousy rather than genuine concern for what she'd actually witnessed on that flight. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. Finch, listening carefully, asked Deborah directly why she'd pursued the theft allegation so aggressively despite 2 failed searches turning up nothing. Deborah's answer came fast. Too fast. The same rehearsed line about 22 years of instincts, though this time it landed noticeably flatter in a room full of people finally scrutinizing it closely. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. With respect, I said, unable to hold it back any longer. Instinct isn't evidence. And I'd like the panel to ask Ms. Whitfield how many times those particular instincts have led her to accuse a passenger of theft before, and how many of those passengers looked exactly like me. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. In hindsight, the signs were already there. The room fell silent for a beat too long. Finch cleared his throat and called a 15-minute recess, and I watched Deborah's composed mask slip for the first time since I'd walked in, her hands gathering papers with slightly too much force, her jaw set in a way that reminded me of turbulence on that aircraft 2 weeks earlier. I held on to that thought longer than expected. In the hallway, I overheard fragments of Deborah cornering Finch near the vending machines, her voice low and urgent, insisting this hearing was turning into a
witch hunt, and that her 22 years of service should count for something against unverified accounts from junior staff and confused elderly witnesses.
Finch's response was measured, non-committal, the practiced neutrality of someone who'd clearly learned not to promise anything before deliberations concluded. But even from a distance I could see it wasn't landing the way Deborah needed it to, her usual certainty visibly cracking under scrutiny it had never faced before. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't have predicted what came next. Priya found me near the water fountain during the break, speaking low. "She's rattled," Priya said. "People like her don't handle being questioned well. Watch what she does next. Sometimes that's when they make their worst mistakes. The ones that finally can't be explained away." Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. Later, I think back on it often. I didn't fully understand what Priya meant until 2 days later, when I received a call from Eleanor, her voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard since that first frantic search for her bracelet on the plane. Deborah came to my house, she said. I don't know how she found my address. She wants me to change my statement. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, Eleanor described a woman showing up unannounced at her door that afternoon, still in partial uniform, explaining she was just following up personally on the case, before pivoting to insistently suggest that Eleanor's memory of events might have been influenced by stress, and that her original statement could use some clarifying revisions. It seemed minor against everything else happening. She kept saying she just wanted to help me remember things accurately, Eleanor told me, but it didn't feel like help. It felt like pressure. Exactly what I said the first time, and she didn't like that answer one bit. My stomach turned, imagining that confrontation on Eleanor's own doorstep. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. I encouraged Eleanor to document everything. The time, the conversation, anything Deborah had said, and to inform Priya immediately, aware even as I said it that this behavior represented a significant escalation. A flight attendant showing up uninvited at a witness's private residence to pressure change testimony ahead of a formal internal hearing. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Priya's reaction, when I called her that evening, was sharper than I'd heard from her yet. That's witness tampering. Essentially, she said. If Eleanor's willing to put that in writing, it changes the entire shape of this case, and not in any direction that helps Deborah's position going forward. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. 2 days after visiting Eleanor, Deborah turned her attention to Amy, cornering her in the crew lounge before a shift, reportedly reminding her, not so subtly, that new flight attendants relied heavily on senior staff for scheduling flexibility and favorable route assignments, a comment Amy immediately recognized as a thinly veiled threat. I didn't have the energy to question it further. She told me I should think carefully about whether I really wanted my name attached to something that could follow me for the rest of my career here. Amy told me later, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and fury. I didn't back down, but it scared me. It really did. Resurface again soon enough. Amy, to her credit, reported the conversation directly to Priya's office rather than staying silent, adding intimidation of a subordinate employee to the growing list of concerns now attached to Deborah's name, a list that had, in the span of a single week, expanded well beyond the original bracelet incident entirely. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Meanwhile, the online harassment against me intensified rather than faded. Someone posted my home neighborhood, incorrectly but close enough to cause genuine alarm, and I began noticing unfamiliar cars idling near our street. Probably nothing, Marcus insisted, though we both started checking the locks twice before bed regardless. It sat with me longer than I expected. Felt like such a small thing at the time. A new account, created just days earlier with no other posting history, began sharing increasingly specific personal details about me online. My employer's industry, my daughter's school district, details that felt uncomfortably targeted rather than randomly discovered, though I had no proof yet of exactly who was behind that particular account. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. Priya later confirmed my suspicion through IP logs subpoenaed during the broader investigation. The account traced back to a device registered under Deborah.
Whitfield's home internet connection. Evidence that would prove devastating once it finally surfaced in front of people with the authority to actually act on it. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. None of us knew where this was truly heading.
Growing more desperate as the hearing's second session approached, Deborah made her most reckless move yet. She contacted a local pawn shop database service, claiming professional cause, attempting to check whether an emerald bracelet matching Eleanor's description had been sold or pawned anywhere in the greater Atlanta area in the past 2 weeks. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. When nothing turned up, rather than accepting the obvious conclusion, Deborah reportedly told a colleague she was going to find proof herself if the company wouldn't take the investigation seriously enough. A statement that, in hindsight, should have alarmed everyone who heard it far more than it apparently did at the time. I filed it away without fully understanding why. 3 days before the second hearing session, Deborah drove to the neighborhood where I lived, parking down the street from my house for nearly 40 minutes, an act Marcus first noticed when he left for work and spotted her uniform jacket through the windshield of an unfamiliar sedan idling near our mailbox. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. He didn't approach, unsure at first who she even was, but he photographed the license plate on instinct, a habit from his years working security consulting. And later that day, comparing notes with Priya, we confirmed the vehicle registration matched Deborah Whitfield's name exactly, parked outside my private residence without any conceivable professional justification. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. That discovery changed everything about how seriously the company was forced to treat the growing pattern of behavior. Priya escalated the matter directly to legal and to Skyline Atlantic's chief operating officer, no longer framing this as a disputed passenger complaint but as a documented pattern of harassment, intimidation, and now apparent stalking by an active employee. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. I felt something shift inside me reading Priya's summary of events laid out in writing for the first time. The sheer accumulation of it. The pawn shop calls, Eleanor's doorstep, Amy's threatened schedule, the harassment account traced to Deborah's home network, the sedan parked outside my house. This was no longer about a bracelet. It never really had been. Easy to miss. Marcus wanted to call the police immediately about the parked car. And eventually we did, filing a report that, combined with everything Priya had already gathered, formed the beginning of a case far larger and more serious than anything Deborah herself could have anticipated when she'd first decided, 20 days earlier, that I looked like a thief. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. Couldn't sleep that night, replaying every interaction with Deborah from the very beginning, wondering how someone could spiral this far over an accusation that had unraveled within the first hour of scrutiny. Marcus, sitting beside me in the dark, finally said what I'd been circling for days. This was never really about you specifically. You were just convenient. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. He was right, in a way that felt both clarifying and deeply unsettling. I hadn't done anything wrong on that flight. Nothing at all beyond helping an old woman's grandson and buckling a toddler's seatbelt. And yet I'd become the target of a campaign that had, by this point, genuinely endangered my family's sense of safety in our own home. In hindsight, the signs were already there. The second hearing session was moved up at Priya's insistence. No longer a routine review of a passenger complaint, but an urgent investigation into an employee's conduct. And this time, when I walked into that conference room, I noticed immediately that Deborah's usual composed posture had been replaced by something tighter, more brittle around the edges. I held on to that thought longer than expected. Finch opened by informing the room that new information had come to light warranting immediate attention. And I watched Deborah's expression shift from confusion to dawning, creeping alarm as Priya began laying out, methodically, everything that had accumulated over the past week. Eleanor's doorstep visit, Amy's threatened retaliation, the traced harassment account, the parked sedan. It was a small crack, barely visible then. "This is absurd," Deborah said, her voice rising for the first time I'd heard it lose its careful control. "I was simply following up on an active case. I have every right to conduct my own inquiries when the company clearly wasn't taking this seriously enough." Her union representative shifted uncomfortably beside her, no longer quite as confident in his earlier posture. I didn't know yet how much it would matter.
Priya said evenly, "You don't have investigative authority as a flight attendant. What you've described isn't following up. It's intimidating witnesses and stalking a private citizen at her home. I'd strongly advise you stop characterizing this as diligence." The room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes something breaking open entirely. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered.
Deborah's eyes swept the table, searching for an ally, landing briefly on her union representative, who avoided her gaze entirely, clearly recalculating how much of his professional credibility he was willing to spend defending conduct that had, in the span of one presentation, transformed from a disputed workplace complaint into something approaching genuine legal jeopardy. I couldn't have predicted what came next. "I know what I saw on that plane," Deborah said, quieter now but no less certain, a stubbornness that seemed almost pathological at this point, unwilling to bend even as the evidence against her own conduct piled higher with every sentence Priya read aloud from her carefully compiled, meticulously documented report. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. Finch asked her directly, for the second time, why she'd pursued this so relentlessly despite every piece of evidence pointing away from theft entirely. This time, Deborah's answer came slower, and something in her voice cracked slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of whatever had actually been driving this obsession for the past 3 weeks. "Later, I think back on it often. Because if I'm wrong," she said, so quietly the recorder nearly missed it, "then everything I've built here means nothing. 22 years of trusting my judgment. And it was wrong. Over nothing. Over a bracelet that probably just fell in a seat cushion." The admission hung in the room, the first honest thing she'd said since this entire ordeal began. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, it wasn't an excuse. Not even close. Not for the stalking, the intimidation, the public humiliation she'd inflicted on me over what amounted to little more than wounded professional pride refusing to admit fault. But it was, finally, a crack of honesty in a story she'd spent 3 weeks constructing entirely around her own unshakable certainty. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Finch adjourned the session shortly after, informing both Deborah and me that Skyline Atlantic would be conducting a full formal investigation, that Deborah was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending its outcome, and that additional legal counsel would likely need to be involved given the scope of what had now surfaced during proceedings. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Walking out of that building, I felt no triumph yet, only a heavy, complicated exhaustion, the sense that something enormous had finally started moving. After weeks of feeling powerless against it, though I understood, even then, that this still wasn't fully over. Not for me, and clearly not for Deborah either. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Deborah left the building separately, avoiding eye contact entirely, her union representative trailing a step behind, already on his phone with what I assumed was legal counsel of his own. The confident, controlled woman from that aircraft 3 weeks earlier now visibly, unmistakably unraveling under the weight of consequences finally catching up to her. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. That night, Priya called with an update. The police report Marcus and I had filed regarding the parked sedan, combined with Eleanor and Amy's statements, was now being reviewed by legal for potential criminal referral. Stalking and witness intimidation carrying real consequences well beyond anything an internal corporate hearing alone could impose. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. I should have felt relief. The strange, hollow unease, aware that Deborah, cornered and exposed, no longer had anything left to lose by continuing to escalate, and people with nothing left to lose, I'd learned by then, were often the most dangerous, the most unpredictable, the most capable of doing something truly reckless. I didn't have the energy to question it further. 2 days later, my fear proved justified. Deborah showed up unannounced at the hospital where my mother was still recovering, claiming at the front desk to be a family friend checking on my well-being, a lie that got her as far as the 4th-floor nurses' station before hospital security, alerted by a wary staff member, intervened. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. Security escorted her out without incident, though the sheer audacity of it, tracking down my mother's hospital location and attempting to gain access under false pretenses, felt like a line crossed so far beyond reasonable that even Marcus, usually calm under pressure, went pale hearing the details over the phone that evening. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Priya, informed immediately, called it exactly what it was. An employee under active investigation for stalking allegedly attempting to locate a complainant's hospitalized family member under false pretenses. Language that finally moved Skyline Atlantic's legal department from cautious internal review into something resembling genuine, urgent alarm. It sat with me longer than I expected. Felt like such a small thing at the time. That night, sitting in my mother's hospital room long after visiting hours had ended, security posted quietly outside the door at Priya's insistence, I finally understood how far this had truly spiraled from a missing bracelet, and how close it had come to touching the one part of my life I'd fought hardest to protect through all of it. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. The morning after the hospital incident, Priya called with news that Skyline Atlantic's legal team had authorized filing for an emergency protective order on our behalf, citing the pattern of stalking, intimidation, and now attempted unauthorized access to my mother's hospital room as grounds sufficient for immediate judicial intervention. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Marcus and I sat in a courthouse waiting room 2 days later, an unfamiliar kind of tired settling into both of us. The specific exhaustion of people who never imagined needing legal protection from a stranger they'd met once, briefly, over a bracelet that had never actually gone missing in the way anyone originally claimed. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. The judge granted a temporary order without much deliberation. The documentation Priya had compiled, leaving little room for doubt. And for the first time in 3 weeks I felt something resembling actual safety rather than the constant, low-grade vigilance that had defined nearly every day since that flight had landed. I filed it away without fully understanding why. Officer Ruiz, informed of the escalating situation through Priya's office, reached out personally, expressing regret that her original investigation hadn't caught the deeper pattern sooner, though she noted, honestly, that nothing in that first afternoon had suggested anything beyond a single overzealous flight attendant making one very bad call. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. People like her count on things staying contained to one incident, Ruiz told me over the phone. They count on victims being too exhausted to keep pushing after the first apology. Real or not, you didn't let that happen. That matters more than you probably realize right now. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss, with the protective order in place and the criminal referral moving through the district attorney's office. Skyline Atlantic's internal investigation accelerated dramatically, no longer a quiet HR matter handled by a mid-level panel, but something that had, within days, landed directly on the desk of the company's chief operating officer. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. Priya called me that evening with unexpected news. The final review hearing, originally scheduled as a routine follow-up, had been elevated significantly, and Skyline Atlantic's CEO, Grant Sullivan, had personally requested to attend given the severity of what had surfaced, a level of corporate attention I hadn't remotely anticipated when this had all started. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. They're taking this seriously now because it's become a legal liability, Priya said candidly. I wish I could tell you it was purely about doing right by you, but I'd rather be honest. Either way, this is your chance to make sure the outcome actually matches everything you've been through. In hindsight, the signs were already there. I sat with that conversation for a long time afterward, turning over a decision I'd been quietly circling for weeks. If the CEO himself would be in that room, if this had finally become significant enough to command that level of attention, then perhaps it was time to stop hiding behind the ordinary passenger I'd let them believe I was. I held on to that thought longer than expected. I called Priya back the next morning. I want you to know something before the final hearing, I said, and told her, for the first time, exactly what my actual position at Skyline Atlantic was. Watching, even over the phone. The stunned silence stretched several seconds longer than I'd expected before she finally responded. It was a small crack, barely visible then. You're the chief safety officer, Priya said slowly, like she was testing the words for accuracy. You've been sitting through this entire process, this entire investigation into your own company's culture, as an anonymous passenger this whole time. I confirmed it was true, and explained, as best I could, exactly why I'd chosen to stay quiet this long. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. I needed to know what would happen to someone without a title behind them, I told her. If I'd flashed my badge on that plane, this whole thing ends in 5 minutes. An apology, a reprimand, maybe nothing at all. I wanted to see how deep it actually went. Now I know. I ever imagined. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. Priya was quiet for a moment. This changes the hearing significantly, she finally said. Are you certain you want to reveal it there, in front of everyone, rather than handling this more quietly through your own executive channels? I told her yes, without hesitation. Quiet handling was exactly what had protected Deborah for 22 years already. I couldn't have predicted what came next. That night, I told Marcus everything, the decision I'd made, the reasoning behind it, and watched something like fierce, quiet pride settle across his face as he listened. You've been carrying 2 entire investigations this whole time, he said. Your own healing, and figuring out how broken this system actually is underneath it, felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. My mother, discharged from the hospital just days earlier and recovering steadily at home, listened to the full story for the first time that weekend, having only known the barest outline until then. She reached for my hand with the good side of her body, gripping it tighter than her physical therapist would probably have approved of. You were always stubborn, she said. Good. Later, I think back on it often. Eleanor called that same week, having heard through Priya's office that the case had escalated significantly. I want to be there, she said firmly. At the hearing. Out loud. In that room. That none of this should have ever happened the way it did. I told her I'd be grateful to have her there. I noticed it, then let it go. For now. Amy reached out as well, nervous but resolute. I already lost the comfortable version of my job here the moment I filed that statement, she said. I might as well see this through completely. Whatever happens to me for it, at least I'll know I did the right thing when it actually mattered. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Mr. The man from seat 12A, whose business card I'd kept folded in my wallet since that very first afternoon, offered to attend as well. A stranger who'd become, almost accidentally, one of the steadiest sources of support throughout this entire ordeal, simply by refusing to look away when it would have been easier to. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Priya prepared the final materials meticulously, compiling every document, every statement, every piece of corroborating evidence into a single, comprehensive file, careful to ensure nothing could be dismissed, minimized, or quietly buried the way the earlier complaint against Deborah had apparently been allowed to disappear 18 months before. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. Grant Sullivan's office reached out directly 2 days before the hearing. A brief, formal email confirming his attendance and requesting a private pre-meeting with me beforehand. A request that, 3 weeks earlier, would have felt impossible to imagine given where I'd started. Handcuffed by circumstance to an accusation I hadn't earned. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. I met with Sullivan the morning of the hearing, in his office rather than the conference room downstairs, and watched him read through the compiled file in near silence, his expression shifting from professional composure to something closer to genuine, unguarded alarm as he reached the section detailing the hospital incident. I didn't have the energy to question it further. "I owe you a personal apology," he said finally, closing the folder. "Not a corporate one. This should never have gone this far. And the fact that it took this level of documentation to get proper attention tells me our reporting systems have failed people long before you ever boarded that flight. That small detail would resurface again soon enough." I appreciated the honesty, though I told him plainly that an apology, however sincere, wouldn't be enough on its own. Real change would require examining exactly how Deborah's earlier complaint had been buried, who had buried it, and what structural gaps had allowed a pattern like this to persist unexamined for over 2 decades of employment. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Sullivan agreed, and promised, whatever the outcome of Deborah's individual case, a broader audit of complaint handling procedures across the airlines. Entire flight crew division, a promise I intended to hold him to personally, in whatever capacity I chose to continue serving this company going forward. It sat with me longer than I expected. Felt like such a small thing at the time. Deborah, meanwhile, arrived that morning with her attorney rather than her union representative. The shift itself signaling how seriously her legal exposure had grown. Criminal referral pending. Protective order granted. Employment likely finished regardless of whatever the internal hearing formally decided about her conduct. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. Her attorney had reportedly advised her to say as little as possible, to let the process unfold without further self-incrimination. Advice that seemed, from what Priya later described, to directly conflict with Deborah's own deep, almost compulsive need to control every narrative she found herself inside of. None of us knew where this was truly heading. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. Word had begun circulating quietly through Skyline Atlantic's regional offices that this hearing carried unusual weight, unusual attendance, an unusual level of executive attention for what had officially begun as a routine passenger complaint about a missing piece of jewelry that had, it now seemed clear to almost everyone involved, never actually been stolen at all. I filed it away without fully understanding why. I dressed carefully that final morning, not in the deliberately ordinary gray blazer from the first hearing, but in my actual work attire, the tailored navy suit I wore to executive safety briefings, deliberately choosing to let my appearance finally match the position I'd spent 3 weeks quietly withholding from everyone in that building except Priya and now Sullivan. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. Marcus drove me that morning, both of us largely silent. Zoe's booster seat still installed in the back from the school run earlier. A small, ordinary detail that felt oddly grounding against the enormity of what was about to happen inside that 4th-floor conference room within the hour. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. "Whatever happens in there," Marcus said, pulling into the parking garage, "you already changed something." Eleanor spoke up. That old man from the plane spoke up. People don't usually do that unless someone shows them it's actually possible to be believed. I held onto that thought walking through the lobby doors. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. Priya met me near the elevator, her expression carefully composed but her eyes betraying real anticipation. "Everyone's already seated," she said quietly. Sullivan, Finch, Deborah and her attorney, Eleanor, Amy, and Mr. Daniel's just arrived downstairs. This is it. I told her, honestly, that I didn't think readiness was really the point anymore. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. The point, I said, is that it happens regardless, ready or not. I've been ready enough for 3 weeks now. I just didn't have the room yet to prove it. Priya nodded, pressed the elevator button, and we rode up together in a silence that felt less like nervousness now and more like quiet, gathering resolve. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. The elevator doors opened onto the 4th floor, and through the glass wall of the conference room ahead, I could see them all already seated, waiting, unaware that the ordinary passenger from seat 14C was about to walk in wearing the exact uniform of authority she'd deliberately hidden from every single one of them for 3 long, exhausting weeks. In hindsight, the signs were already there. I walked into that conference room and every head turned, the low murmur of pre-hearing conversation dying instantly. Deborah glanced up first, her expression flickering with brief confusion at the change in my clothing before settling back into practiced composure, clearly assuming it meant nothing more than a woman dressing more formally for a serious occasion. I held on to that thought longer than expected. I took the seat Priya indicated, near the head of the table rather than the far end where I'd sat during the previous session. A small positional shift that a few sharp-eyed observers, Finch among them, seemed to register immediately as meaningful, though nobody said anything aloud just yet. It was a small crack, barely visible then. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Sullivan opened the hearing himself this time, his voice carrying the particular gravity of someone who understood exactly how much weight this moment now held. Before we proceed, he said, there's a piece of information relevant to this case that hasn't yet been disclosed to everyone in this room, and I believe it needs to be addressed directly. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. He turned to me. Carter, would you like to share it yourself? Or would you prefer I do? I appreciated the offer, the deliberate deference, and told him I'd prefer to say it myself. After 3 weeks of carefully choosing every word, I wasn't about to let this particular sentence belong to anyone else. I couldn't have predicted what came next. My name is Simone Carter, I said, looking directly at Deborah now, watching her expression carefully. For the past 4 years, I've served as Skyline Atlantic's chief safety officer. I was flying home on a personal trip to see my hospitalized mother when Ms. Whitfield decided, without any evidence, that I looked like a thief, felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. The silence that followed felt physical, a held breath spreading around the entire table. Deborah's face went through several rapid transformations. Confusion first, then dawning disbelief, then something closer to genuine horror as the full weight of what she'd actually done, and to whom, finally began settling into place behind her eyes. Later, I think back on it often. You're the... Deborah started, then stopped, seeming to physically struggle with the sentence. You're the CSO, she finally managed, her voice smaller than I'd heard it at any point across the past 3 weeks. All that practiced authority draining visibly out of her posture in real time in front of everyone seated around that table. I noticed it, then let it go. For now. I confirmed. Though I'd ask you to consider something important. My title has absolutely nothing to do with whether what happened to me on that flight was wrong. It was wrong regardless of who I turned out to be. The only difference my title makes is that now, finally, someone with real power is sitting in this room. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Deborah's attorney leaned toward her, whispering something urgent, but Deborah seemed barely to register it. Her eyes still fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between shock, humiliation, and the dawning, sickening realization that every excuse she'd spent 3 weeks constructing had just permanently and publicly collapsed. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. "This doesn't change anything about what I witnessed," Deborah said finally, though the conviction had drained entirely from her voice, replaced by something closer to desperation. The sound of someone grasping for solid ground that had already fully given way beneath her feet in front of everyone who mattered. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. "You're right," I said evenly. "It doesn't change what you witnessed. Because what you witnessed was a black woman helping an elderly passenger's grandson buckle a seatbelt and pick up a dropped toy. That's the entirety of what actually happened. Everything else came from somewhere else. Somewhere inside you that had nothing to do with me at all." It was easy to dismiss in the moment. Finch, visibly shaken by the revelation, asked to proceed with the remaining testimony, and Eleanor was brought in next, walking slowly to the empty chair reserved for her, her eyes finding mine briefly before she sat, a small, steadying nod passing between us before she turned to address the panel directly. I didn't have the energy to question it further. "I want to be very clear," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "I never once told anyone I believed my bracelet had been stolen. I said it might have slipped off. I said the clasp was loose. Every single escalation after that moment came from Ms. Whitfield's own decisions, not from anything I ever asked for or believed. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. When my bracelet turned up 3 days later," she continued, and I felt my breath catch, hearing this detail for the first time myself, caught in the lining of my cardigan, pocket exactly where I'd tucked it during turbulence and simply forgotten. I called Skyline Atlantic immediately to correct the record. Nobody called me back for over a week. For now, I simply kept moving forward. The room absorbed that revelation in stunned silence. The bracelet had been found, days after the accusation, in Eleanor's own pocket, exactly as she'd worried might be the case from the very beginning, and the company had sat on that correction for over a week while I continued absorbing public humiliation, harassment, and eventually stalking over an item that had never actually been missing at all in any real sense. It sat with me longer than I expected. Finch turned sharply toward the HR representative seated near the door, demanding to know why that correction had never been escalated or shared with the ongoing investigation. The representative stammered something about administrative backlog, an explanation that satisfied absolutely no one in that room, least of all Sullivan, whose expression had grown visibly darker with every passing minute. Felt like such a small thing at the time. Amy testified next, her voice steadier than I expected, describing in careful detail the moment on the aircraft when she'd questioned Deborah's account, Deborah's dismissive response, and later, the veiled threats about her job security when Amy had finally decided to submit a formal statement supporting the truth over her supervisor's version of events. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet, Mr. asked. Calm and measured, describing exactly what he'd witnessed from seat 12A. The two brief, innocent moments Deborah had twisted into something sinister. The searched bag turning up nothing. The escalating aggression that had never once been matched by any actual evidence throughout the entire encounter he'd watched unfold. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. I've flown for 30 years, he said, addressing the panel directly. I've seen this happen before. To other people. Plenty of times. Usually nothing comes of it. I'm only here now because this woman, he gestured toward me, had the standing and the resolve to make sure it didn't just disappear the way it usually does. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Deborah sat frozen through all of it. Her attorney occasionally leaning in with whispered counsel, she seemed increasingly unable to absorb. Her earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something raw and unguarded. The mask finally, completely stripped away in front of the very people whose respect she'd spent 22 years carefully cultivating. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. When Finch finally turned to her and asked if she had anything further to add, Deborah was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the table. I thought I was protecting someone, she said finally, so quietly the recorder nearly missed it again. I've always thought that's what I was doing. Protecting people. Too. I filed it away without fully understanding why. You weren't protecting anyone, I said, unable to hold back any longer. You were protecting your own certainty. There's a difference. And it's the exact difference that let this happen to me. And apparently to at least one other passenger before me. For over 2 decades without a single real consequence. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. Sullivan raised a hand gently, signaling it was time to move toward closing the session. We have more than enough here, he said, to move forward with a final decision. And I don't intend to let this drag on any further than it already has. MS. You'll be notified formally within the hour. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. Deborah rose slowly when the session was called to a close, gathering her things with hands that visibly shook now. All that rigid, controlled posture from 3 weeks earlier utterly gone. Replaced by something smaller, more human, and undeniably, finally accountable in a way she'd successfully avoided for the entirety of her career until this exact moment. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. She paused near the door, looking back at me once, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she simply said, I hope you're satisfied, her voice flat, still unable, even now, to fully separate her own wounded pride from the very real damage she'd inflicted on so many people around her. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. I'm not satisfied, I told her honestly. Satisfaction isn't really available after something like this. What I am is finished carrying it alone. And finished letting people like you decide, on instinct and nothing else, who deserves to be treated with basic human dignity in this world. She said nothing further and walked out. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. The room exhaled collectively once the door closed behind her. A tension breaking that had built steadily across 3 full weeks and finally, fully, released in that quiet 4th-floor conference room. Eleanor reached over and took my hand, squeezing it tightly, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said. "For all of it." Nothing about it felt urgent. "Not yet. You have nothing to be sorry for," I told her, meaning it completely. "You tried to stop this from the very first moment it started spiraling. The people who owe apologies are the ones who chose not to listen when you did." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and I felt the weight of her guilt finally begin to ease. In hindsight, the signs were already there. Amy approached next, still visibly shaken from her own testimony. "Thank you for not making me feel foolish for waiting as long as I did to speak up," she said. I told her that speaking up at all, given everything she stood to lose, mattered far more than any perceived delay ever could. I held on to that thought longer than expected. Sullivan asked to speak with me privately once the room had mostly cleared, his expression grave. "This goes well beyond one flight attendant," he said. "Eleanor's correction sitting unactioned for a week. The earlier buried complaint from 18 months ago. This points to systemic failures I intend to personally oversee correcting. Starting immediately." It was a small crack, barely visible then. "I appreciate that," I told him. "But I want more than good intentions in a private conversation. I want this documented, audited, and reported transparently, including to the passengers who were failed before I ever boarded that flight." Sullivan agreed without hesitation, and something in his tone told me he understood exactly how serious I was. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Priya joined us, laying out immediate next steps. Deborah's formal termination pending final paperwork. Referral of the stalking and intimidation evidence to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges, and a comprehensive audit of every unresolved passenger complaint filed against crew members over the past 5 years. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't have predicted what came next. "Including the one from 18 months ago," I said. Priya nodded firmly. "We're already trying to locate that passenger for a formal follow-up and apology. It's long overdue, and it should have happened the moment that original complaint was filed, not 18 months and one more incident later." Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. Walking out of Skyline Atlantic's headquarters that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't fully expected after 3 exhausting weeks. Not triumph exactly, but a settled, hard-won clarity. The sense of having pushed a genuinely broken system, however reluctantly, into finally examining itself in the daylight rather than quietly burying its own failures. Later, I think back on it often. Marcus was waiting in the parking garage, and the moment I told him everything, the reveal, Eleanor's testimony, Deborah's unraveling, he pulled me into a hug so tight I nearly lost my breath entirely. "You did it," he said. "I never doubted you would. But you actually did it." I let myself finally believe that too. I noticed it, then let it go. For now, that night, sitting at our kitchen table with Zoe finally asleep and my mother resting comfortably at home, I allowed myself, for the first time in 3 weeks, to simply feel proud rather than exhausted, aware that whatever came next in terms of formal consequences, the truth itself had finally, fully surfaced. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Deborah's termination was finalized within 2 days, effective immediately, her 22 years of seniority ultimately weighing nothing against a documented pattern of false accusation. witness intimidation, unauthorized access attempts at a hospital, and stalking a private citizen's residence, none of which any tenure could reasonably excuse or outweigh. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. The union representative who'd initially agreed to support her formally withdrew his involvement once the full scope became public within internal channels, citing conduct that fell entirely outside anything the union could defensibly stand behind, a quiet acknowledgement that even her strongest institutional allies had finally run out of ways to justify her actions. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. Word spread quickly through Skyline Atlantic's crew network, and I heard, secondhand through Amy, that several colleagues who'd once treated Deborah's authority as untouchable were now quietly reconsidering old memories. Small comments, dismissive incidents they'd witnessed over the years and never questioned, wondering how many other passengers had quietly absorbed treatment like mine without ever pushing back. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. The district attorney's office, reviewing the compiled evidence, filed formal charges against Deborah for stalking and witness tampering within the month, citing the parked vehicle outside my home, the pressured visit to Eleanor's house, and the attempted hospital access as sufficient grounds to proceed with prosecution regardless of any prior clean record. I didn't have the energy to question it further. Deborah's attorney negotiated for reduced charges, and though I felt no particular need for maximum punishment, I did attend the arraignment, sitting quietly in the gallery, watching the woman who'd once stood so certain in that aircraft aisle now stand small and diminished before a judge who clearly had no patience for the details of her case. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. She accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding a lengthy trial in exchange for probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with me, Eleanor, or Amy, a resolution that felt, if not fully satisfying, at least appropriately proportionate to the accumulated weight of everything she'd actually done. For now, I simply kept moving forward. Skyline Atlantic issued a public statement 3 weeks after the hearing, correcting the record entirely, confirming no theft had ever occurred, that the accused passenger had been fully cleared by law enforcement from the very first day, and formally apologizing for the harm caused by both the original incident and the airline's initial mishandling of the aftermath. It sat with me longer than I expected. The statement didn't mention my title. At my own request, I wanted the correction to stand on the actual facts, not on the weight of my position, a distinction that mattered deeply to me given everything this entire ordeal had ultimately been about in the first place. Felt like such a small thing at the time. I didn't think much of it then. Not yet. Local news ran a follow-up segment correcting their earlier, misleading coverage, interviewing Eleanor directly this time, who spoke plainly and firmly about how quickly an innocent moment had spiraled into something none of them, herself included, had ever wanted or intended to happen to anyone. Looking back, that detail mattered more than I realized. None of us knew where this was truly heading. Online, the original viral clip was eventually removed for violating platform misinformation policies, though I understood by then that corrections rarely travel as far or as fast as the original accusation had. Quiet, lingering unfairness I'd simply have to live with regardless of how thoroughly the record had ultimately been set straight. It was one more piece I'd remember for years. Priya's audit. Meanwhile, located the passenger from the buried complaint 18 months earlier, a young man named Terrence Yates, who'd been quietly issued a small travel voucher, and told the matter was resolved, never informed that his complaint had actually been substantiated, never given the acknowledgement or apology he genuinely deserved at the time. I filed it away without fully understanding why. Sullivan personally called Terrence to apologize, and Skyline Atlantic issued him a formal written correction along with meaningful compensation, a gesture 2 years overdue, but one that visibly moved him during the brief follow-up interview Priya later shared with me, his relief evident even through a second-hand account of the conversation. Something about it stayed with me long afterward. The audit uncovered 2 additional complaints involving other crew members across different routes, patterns that had similarly been minimized or quietly buried by managers, unwilling to challenge senior staff, prompting Skyline Atlantic to overhaul its entire complaint intake and review process from the ground up over the following 6 months. At the time, it seemed almost inconsequential. I worked directly with Sullivan's team on those reforms, insisting on mandatory independent review for any complaint alleging discriminatory treatment, a permanent record requirement, preventing quiet, informal resolutions from disappearing entirely, and regular bias training for crew across every hub. Changes that felt, finally, like something built to actually last. I wouldn't understand its weight until much later. Eleanor and I stayed close after everything settled, meeting for coffee every few weeks. An unlikely friendship forged out of an afternoon neither of us had wanted or expected, though she often said, only half joking, that losing her bracelet briefly had turned out to be the most important accident of her entire year. It was a quiet moment, easy to miss. Amy was promoted the following year to a senior training role focused specifically on bias awareness and passenger de-escalation, a position she told me she'd never have pursued if that flight hadn't forced her to finally understand exactly what silence, however comfortable, actually costs the people standing closest to it. I kept telling myself it would pass quickly. Mr. Exchanged holiday cards for years afterward. A small, steady thread of gratitude connecting back to that first business card pressed into my hand in a half-empty aircraft cabin. Proof that a single stranger's decision to simply pay attention could ripple outward further than either of us had imagined at the time. Nothing about it felt urgent. Not yet. My mother continued her recovery steadily, eventually regaining most of her mobility, and though she never fully understood every detail of what her daughter had gone through that particular spring, she never let me forget, in her own quiet way, how proud she was that I'd refused to let it simply disappear. In hindsight, the signs were already there. Zoe, older now, occasionally asks about the story, and I tell it to her carefully, honestly, emphasizing not the injustice itself but everything that happened afterward. The people who chose truth over comfort. The slow, difficult work of making a broken system finally answer for itself instead of quietly protecting the people it should have held accountable. I held on to that thought longer than expected. Skyline Atlantic's revised complaint policy now bears an internal name few passengers will ever know or need to know. Though I know it, and I think of it every time I review a new safety protocol crossing my desk. A permanent reminder written into the company's actual procedures, rather than left to fade quietly into memory. It was a small crack, barely visible then. I still fly Skyline Atlantic regularly, Though I've never again boarded a flight in anonymous jeans and a hoodie without at least half-consciously wondering whether today might be another test of exactly how the system treats the people who don't announce their own importance before anyone has a chance to judge them unfairly. I didn't know yet how much it would matter. Deborah Whitfield. Last I heard through the occasional industry grapevine. Works outside aviation entirely now. Her 22 years of seniority ultimately amounting to nothing. More than a cautionary story other crew members quietly reference whenever someone's instincts start outpacing their evidence in ways that begin to feel dangerously familiar. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. I couldn't have predicted what came next. I don't think about her often anymore, though when I do, it's rarely with anger, more a kind of tired clarity about how ordinary, how mundane, the roots of real harm so often turn out to be. Wounded pride and unchecked authority dressed up as instinct, allowed to run unchecked for far too long by people who simply looked away. Felt ordinary, almost forgettable in the moment. What stays with me instead is everything that grew out of it. Eleanor's friendship, Amy's growth, Terrence Yates finally getting the apology he'd waited 2 years for, and a company forced, however reluctantly, into finally building something better than the quiet, convenient silence it had relied on for far too long before that flight ever landed. Later, I think back on it often. A year later, Skyline Atlantic published its first public accountability report detailing complaint outcomes across the entire airline, a document I helped shape from the very beginning, transparent in a way the industry rarely allowed itself to be, naming patterns without naming individuals, showing real numbers instead of quiet reassurances. I noticed it, then let it go. For now. Terrence Yates sent me a short message after reading about the report online, thanking me for something he said he never expected any stranger to actually follow through on. I told him the truth, that his case had been the one that finally proved this wasn't just about me, that it had never really been only about me at all. It seemed minor against everything else happening. Marcus framed a single printed page from that final hearing transcript. The moment I'd said my name and title aloud for the first time, and hung it quietly in my home office, not as a trophy exactly, more as a reminder of exactly how much effort real accountability actually requires when a system would rather look away. Even so, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. I still keep Officer Ruiz's card in my wallet, worn soft at the corners now, alongside Mr. Danielle's original business card, small artifacts from an afternoon that changed the direction of far more than just one difficult flight, evidence that ordinary people paying attention can still, sometimes, bend a broken system back towards something fairer. I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Eleanor's bracelet sits, ironically, in a small display case in Skyline Atlantic's Regional Training Center now, donated by Eleanor herself. Quiet, permanent visual aid used. In every new bias awareness training session, a small emerald reminder of exactly how quickly assumption can outrun evidence when nobody bothers to stop and actually look. Still, something in me stayed uneasy about it. I think, sometimes, about how easily this could have ended differently. If Eleanor hadn't pushed back. If Amy had stayed silent. If Mr. Daniels had simply looked away like so many passengers before him, and I try, every day since, to be the person in the room who refuses to look away either. It was easy to dismiss in the moment. People sometimes ask why I didn't simply reveal my title the moment Deborah first accused me on that plane. And I tell them the truth every single time. Because somebody needed to see, clearly and without excuse, exactly how this system treats people who walk through the world without a badge to protect them. I didn't have the energy to question it further. That flight taught me more about my own company and about the quiet, cumulative cost of unchecked authority than 4 years sitting behind a safety officer's desk ever fully had. And it changed, permanently, the kind of accountability I now insist on building into every policy that crosses my desk. That small detail would resurface again soon enough. I flew home that spring to say goodbye to a version of my mother's health I feared I might not get back, and instead found something else entirely waiting for me in seat 14C. A reminder that dignity shouldn't require proof, and that sometimes the truest justice comes not from power revealed, but from ordinary people finally refusing to stay silent. For now, I simply kept moving forward.